This is a very interesting study for me. I was born and raised in a missionary family. Actually, born and raised here in Taiwan, to missionaries in Taiwan. So you could say that I have been in a Christian environment literally all of my life, except for that period of my life where I really rebelled against faith, rebelled against God, and tried to run away. Not very easy to do, and I certainly wouldn't suggest it, not unless you want to have to bear the scars of a loving father bringing back his child. So, so I've heard the story of Esther since a young child. I heard it in Taiwanese when I went to Taiwanese Sunday school, and then I heard it in Hong Kong in Cantonese when we were in Hong Kong. I've also had the opportunity to hear it in Mandarin, and now get to preach it in English. I'd much rather preach it in English, I promise you. But the thing that I've really appreciated about it is being able to draw from a very wide spectrum. There's no possible way I could read all the things I'd like to read about this book, but I just find it more and more fascinating as we get into it. And also just with the facts of life, that there's a whole lot of things that happen in our life that we don't necessarily attribute to saying, that's God, that's a God thing. Usually when we say it's a God thing, it's something that's big and unusual and out of the ordinary. And as we saw last week, that really isn't necessarily the case, that God is really actively involved in the details of our life, and he's just, for whatever reason, sometimes I think that God is rather shy. He's not one for big, lavish, except when you look at creation, that's pretty lavish. I mean, the whole idea of creating the universe, that's pretty fantastic. And if God was showing off, that's probably one time when he was showing off, and another time may have been when he made humans in his own image. But, for the most part, God's just kind of shy. He's not in the public eye. And really, the only way that he would be is if he shines in our life, and we let him be revealed in and through us. And as I reflect back over this, and again reflect back over the life that I've lived and how I'm where I am now, I would ask then some of the questions about who are some of the people that have had an influence in your life. Who are some of the people who have had an influence in your life? And obviously, I would begin with mom and dad. Huge, huge influence. For whatever reason, God led my father, who grew up on a farm in Michigan, to decide that he was going to go to China as a missionary. Now, how does a farm boy up in northern Michigan decide that he's going to go to China as a missionary? Well, I don't know how that happened, but he initially went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and there in Chicago, excuse me, he met up with a young lady who wanted to be a brain surgeon, who had gotten straight A's all her life and failed in her first year of college. She was devastated. Just realized and thought that God was trying to speak to her about going another direction. And so she, too, then went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and there she met who was later to be her husband. And the two got married. And God directed them to go to China. But this is 1950s, thereabouts, and if you look at your history, that China was closed and you couldn't go to China. So they decided they would go to the next closest place, and that was Taiwan. Arrived in Taiwan early 1952, and very shortly after their being arrived in Taiwan, I was born. That's how I came to Taiwan. I didn't have any choice about it. Mom and Dad decided that for me. And when you look back in your life like that, and it's been a wonderful experience, because in Jiayi, I grew up. I learned how to gong dai gi, and I've forgotten most of the dai gi. And so it's gone, but it'll come back. And then just a deep love that God's given me to this country. Why? Because mom and dad made their way to Taiwan, and I had the experience of growing up here. And so if we look in our life, we would have to say that there have been some people, whether we like them or not. I mean, I know of some missionary kids who, they despise Taiwan. They would never come back to Taiwan but they hated mom and dad too. I have a friend of mine who was in my class. Thank you very much, Katie. Had a friend in my class who came from a family that was rather dysfunctional, and she despises Christianity. She despises anything to do with Taiwan. And how does it not work for her, and it works for me? All I'm saying is this: when we look back in our life, if we take the time to think about these things, we see that there are people, parents, siblings, teachers, coaches, who have had an influence in our life. For me, my soccer coaches really were great men. And I'm so grateful for them because they instilled in me a lot of character that I might not have had were I not around such good men. My high school coach was a ranger in the Army. He had some crazy stories to tell, honestly, about this would have been in World War II, about sneaking around in the back behind enemy lines, and amazing story. Well, for me, as a kid, I'm thinking, wow, what a brave man, what an amazing guy. He had a great effect on me too. And then I think of teachers. Ooh, yeah. The teachers I hated the most, but probably the best ones for me. That's what I've been finding out anyway. And then we think about spiritual leaders. Spiritual leaders are people who have influenced our spiritual formation. What about people who have made an impact there? Right after I got married, I didn't go the normal route of doing premarital counseling. My counseling had to be done after I got married. And my advice to married people and unmarried people is don't be afraid of getting counseling. There's nothing weak about that. I mean, I go get advice for financial things. Why wouldn't I get advice about being married? I mean, come on. So there was a man in the church there who, again, great big guy, a man's man, and he started telling me some things about how I was really a lousy husband. And again, a great help to me. There's also people who have written books, produced movies, books and movies and videos maybe that we've seen that have had a profound effect. I say all that to say this, that as we look back on our lives, we realize there's many people who've shaped and molded our thinking and our acting. So I have this I want to ask this question then. Well, preface to that question. In Hong Kong, I had a teacher, a language teacher, who would come and she would teach me Mandarin. And she was Shanghai Ren and a graduate of Beijing Daxue. And so her language, her Mandarin was Biaojun. It was very good. And she was very hard on me to make sure that my Mandarin would be pronounced right. I was grateful for it. But we would have these conversations. Her family went through the Cultural Revolution. She watched as her classmates beat her father nearly to death. And they came from a fairly well-to-do family, and they were thrown out of their home. So she had all this within her, but I wanted to talk to her about it, and she says, no, I can't talk to her. There's just this deep bitterness. And then we got into this discussion about why do these things happen? Her reply to me was, it's just fate. It's just fate. And in other words, it was your lot in life. Somebody threw the dice, and that was your number decided by fate. And so I talked to her a bit more, and I thought, well, if it's just chance and just fate, then how do you look back through your life and make any sense out of it whatsoever? Because I don't believe it's fate, because I don't think that I don't believe that the encounters that I've had in my life, nor do I believe the encounters that you've had in your life are left completely up to chance. I don't think they just happened. And if it did happen, that it was by chance, does that mean then, when I've had this encounter, that my response to this person or to this event is simply a matter of chance? In other words, does my thinking about it and pondering, does it bring any kind of, can I have any kind of response to it? So I have a hard time with this with this idea on a couple of things that life is just chance, because I don't believe that my thoughts are random thoughts, which is what chance is. It just randomly comes to pass and so forth. And I don't think that that's the way my thoughts are. But if it's not by chance, then who or what is manipulating the events of life that shape us and make us who we are? Well, for me, the answer, quite frankly, is God. Is God. So, for me, the answer is God is visible in these encounters. Though I don't necessarily see him, I see the hand of God that's involved in it. Now, we might want to ask ourselves the question then, am I convinced that I am the master of my destiny? Do I have control or charge over my destiny? Or is my destiny in the hands of fate? Or is my destiny in the hands of someone greater than me? The reason I have these discussions is because my oldest son, who grew up in my family and has turned and moved away from the faith. So yes, we do have these discussions. They're civil discussions. And so, because I want to ask him the question, well, listen, son, I mean, how does it happen you're born to Baptist, your parents were Baptists and raised in a Bible-preaching family, and how is it now that you look back through all that and you say, oh, it can't be right, there's something wrong with it, you've turned away from it? I said, how does that work anyway? Is it just by chance? So if it wasn't by chance, then is there somebody manipulating it? If there's somebody manipulating it, then there must be somebody bigger who can operate these things, and who's that? Who's that? So I say all that because when we look at this story, we can see that there's not just merely fate that leads us through life. It's our faith in someone who directs and influences us. Now, there's a word that's important for us to look at here. It's called the word providence, because many writers and commentators about the life in the book of Esther say that it is a book that is about the providence of God. The word providence is very interesting. And I want to tie it into this idea of how we got to where we are. The word providence comes from it's a Latin word, provideo. And you might see the word video there. Pro means before. Video means I see. So, provideo means before I see. The root word meaning for providence is foresight. In other words, it's seeing a need before it happens and providing for it. We would call that the providence of God. We would call that the providence of a kind person who sees that you have need for your school bill, and so they pay your tuition. And the providence then, when we would look at something that's provided for us, is someone saw and it was provided for us beforehand, not afterwards, not when it's too late. So the providence then of God has this idea of foresight, the divine foreknowledge and the divine activity that results from that foreknowledge. Now that's an important concept. It's a biblical concept, and I want to show it to you because I think it's very important for us to see this when we look into the Gospels and when we look into this story. So, J. Sidlow Baxter writes, and he says, the purpose of the book, talking about the book of Esther, is to demonstrate the providential care of God over his people. So we could say the foresight of God in seeing the needs of his people. It is vital to see this because herein lies the living significance and permanent value of this book. The great thing here is the fact of a providential preservation. Providential as distinct from what we call miraculous. We are meant to see the providential overruling as distinct from supernatural intervening. God saw beforehand what was going to happen. He sees it all together, and he has provided a way whereby his will shall be done. So, this providence then is also spoken about in the New Testament. One of the disciples, in fact, is one of the chief disciples of Jesus, is Peter. There was three top three. There's Peter, James, and John. Of those three, we could say Peter was probably the leader. He's the one who was the spokesman then for the disciples after Jesus went back into heaven. And here's what Peter has to say. In 1 Peter chapter 1, he writes, talking in his introduction to his letter, he says, I am Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. And this letter is to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Notice, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with his blood. May grace and peace be multiplied to you. He is writing this letter to those who are elect exiles, chosen exiles. They're the chosen people of God who are now in exile and dispersion, which is where Esther is. This is where that dispersion takes place. And he says in verse 2, it comes as according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. See, for us, we might have a problem with this. God has no problem with it. Why? For you and me, there's now, there's before, and there's still to come. And it's always going to be that way. We live within time, but imagine, if you can, what it would be like to be outside of time. And to be outside of time would mean you not only see the beginning and the end, you have to be the beginning and the end. Because if as soon as there's a beginning, that's when the time begins. And as soon as the end, that's when time ends. That's what time is. It's the measurement of our existence. And so God, being always existent, he's the beginning and the end. And I say that because God sees everything all at once. Back before the creation of the world, back before the beginning, back before anything, God knew there was going to be a beginning, and he knew my beginning, and he knows your beginning. He knows my end. He knows your end already. And he also knows when I'm going to begin this sermon and if I'm going to end this sermon. He knows all that. He knows that there's going to, it's all within God's context. And so he also knows that when and if I do end this sermon, he knows what's going to happen next. It's all within God's foreknowledge. He gets it all. And so, because God knows all that already, then he knows how things are going to work out and how he's going to work everything out. He's an infinite God who's infinitely involved. Here's what Paul has to say about it. Paul has to say this about the providence of God. You have to understand that Paul was a guy who rebelled against, who was anti-Christian, anti-everything Jesus until he met Jesus, changed his life completely. And then he became this incredible theologian. And here's what he writes. He says, for those whom he foreknew, this is Romans 8, 29 and 30. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. So, to be glorified, we talk about going to heaven. How many of you know you're going to heaven? Good, good, good. How do you know you're going to heaven? Well, because I know I'm going to heaven because before the glorification is the justification. I'm justified through Jesus Christ. Before I was justified, I was called. And before I was called, I was predestined. Before I was predestined, it was according then to the foreknowledge that God did. God knew the decision I was going to make. I say all that to say this, because we think that we're the masters of our own destiny. Yet, and to that end, I do agree. I believe that God has given us the ability to freely make a decision, to decide yes or no. That's why I say that, like today, for example, I come here and I see you. Even as I'm talking, I make certain decisions. How long this is going to last and what needs to be cut out. I think I do it fairly freely. But I can't do it without God already knowing what decisions I'm going to make. Because he's not limited to time. And on that, God already knows the decisions I'm going to make. I find it very difficult to believe that Jesus Christ, that God who is love, shows his love by giving himself to die on the cross, and he's leaving out a certain bunch of people who, for one reason or another, he's not going to include them. I don't think it was his decision. I think he knows what their decision is to reject God. Now, I can tell you that there's a whole lot of people who don't agree with that, okay? I just go back to this scripture here, and the scripture says, and I'll read it again, for those whom he foreknew, that's the providence, all right? He also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers, and those whom he predestined, he also called, justified, and glorified, okay? So, all that is prefaced to this story that we're talking about now, the story about Esther, the story of how the things of God are shown in this in these events. And so the story of Esther has 5 major characters, 5 major players who reveal God's power and presence in their lives. The title of my sermon this morning is this evening, is Are We Players or Are We Pawns? Are we players or are we pawns? In other words, are we on God's chessboard and God says, you go there. You go there. Where God's actually the chess player and he's manipulating and moving us and putting us right where he wants us to. Or are we actually players in God's field where we actually can participate and be actively involved and decide that, yes, I'm in. Yes, I want to do what's right. Yes, I want to follow God. Or would I just throw up my hands and say, dude, you decided for me. You just tell me. I really think that if we're made in the image of God gave us the ability to make decisions, and then God, by his foreknowledge, knows ahead of time what these decisions will be, and he acts accordingly. I don't say he acts accordingly. He's already acted. He knows the decisions we're going to make. And so I'd like for us to look then at these 5 players in the book of Esther, and we will move through these 5 players fairly rapidly. The first one is Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is like the word Pharaoh. Pharaoh is not a name, it's a position. Ahasuerus is not necessarily a name, it's more a position. His name is Xerxes, and there's 3 of them in Persia, Xerxes 1, 2, and 3. This is Xerxes 1. He is the offspring of King Darius. We find him in Esther chapter 1, beginning with verse 1 to verse 4. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him, while he showered the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, in fact, 180 days. Some commentators say this, that Xerxes was getting ready to go to battle, to finish the battle that his father Darius started, or Darius. And Darius started the battle, or started preparing for a battle for the Persians to defeat the Greeks. He died before that took place, so now Xerxes is taking this on, and so he wants to show himself then to be in his father's footsteps, to be the one whom they can follow, and so it took 180 days for him to then parade all of his wealth, all of his belongings, all of this before all the army and the generals and so forth, so they could see how great he was. And now we come to this feast that's been going on for 7 days, and he's going to bring out, literally, the crown jewels. And this is where they say the story is beginning then, and where Vashti the queen comes in. It was Xerxes who consolidated all the kingdom of the regions going from modern Pakistan to modern Pakistan to Sudan in northern Africa. However, Xerxes is a man of questionable character at best. He was quite self-centered, very much concerned about his own appearance. He was capricious in his decisions. Xerxes is the king who ordered a bridge to be built over a place called Hellespont, the Hellespont River. And when he learned that the bridge was destroyed in a large storm that came up, he was so angry that he demanded that the water of the ocean should be whipped 300 times, and that it should be, and they threw some shackles into the water to show that the water needed to be shackled because it destroyed the bridge that he was trying to build. In addition to that, if you happen to be one of the builders of the bridge, you had your head cut off because a storm came by and destroyed the bridge. So he showed how unhappy he was with the builders having their heads taken off. This is also the king who was given a huge sum of money, an enormous sum of money from some loyal follower. And King Xerxes was so enamored and so impressed with this huge sum of money that was given to him that he then gave back, and gave something back in addition to show how much he was impressed by it. However, the man's name is Pythias. Pythias then made this gift, and so after having done so and to show his extreme loyalty, and then Xerxes gives him back, then Pythias says, listen, I have several sons. They are all serving in your army. Would you please allow the oldest son to come take care of me now that I'm old and aged and crippled and I need help? And Xerxes just went into a rage. In such a rage that he took this son that Pythias was asking for, cut him in half, and made the armies to walk in between the body that was split in half. I mean, it's beyond cruel. It's sick. But this is the kind of person that he was. This is the king, then, who drowned the humiliation of his inglorious defeat by taking a plunge into every form of sensuality he could think about. And he publicly offered a prize then for someone who could invent a new form of indulgence, a new form of just sensual pleasure that he could then participate in. He's also the king who then cut a canal through the isthmus of Athos for his fleet, a huge and enormous undertaking. So he had goals that he wanted. He'd get some amazing things done, but he could turn in a moment, he could turn in a flash, and suddenly then be very cruel, very capricious, and unable to be for people to have any sense of confidence in. We see that he also goes to passionate extremes, because we read in fact, if you read in the first part of the chapter there, he asks the queen to come and to expose herself for his drunken friends. She declines, won't go. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And in response, then, he has her banished from the kingdom. At the same time, it's King Xerxes who then gives in to Haman and says, we can write this edict then that makes it legal to kill every single Jew in the Persian Empire. He does some amazing things. He's a person that's very difficult to really deal with and to know what's going on in his head. Another person that we see there is the former Queen Vashti. The Queen Vashti. Esther chapter 1 verse 9 says this: Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So now we have this, this character who is the queen there. Now, I'd like you to notice a couple of things about the scripture here. There's 7 of the king's eunuchs sent then to bring Vashti. Vashti is to come in order to show her beauty, her royal beauty, and to show the peoples and the princes her beauty. Notice it says, for she was lovely to look on. Lovely to look on. This is a little bit of a hint to us on human nature. Let me just explain it. Men are very much affected by their sight, what they see. That's why there's a huge industry of pornography, because it's all about sight and seeing. And that's why God has put within men, and there's a holiness about this, an attraction to the female form. And you'll notice throughout scriptures that when talking about men, it says the men looked on the woman. And in fact, as Jesus says, that if you look on a woman to lust after her, you've sinned. So within men, and this is something that it's a difference between men and women, in that men are very much influenced by the eye gate, what goes in the eye. That's why modesty is a very important thing, and something that we need to understand. On the other hand, I'm not a woman, so I'm just speaking from what's been told to me. And that is, women are not necessarily so much affected by what they see in the eye, but what really makes a difference, what really affects a woman is touch. Touch. So that when Boaz is speaking to the servants with regard to how they're to behave around Ruth, he said to them, he didn't say to them, don't look. He said, don't touch. Don't touch. So, because he's speaking with regard to our humanity and the way that we are. I say that because clearly Vashti knows that she is an object to be desired. And she says, I am not going to be that object. She refuses then to listen to the king, to follow the king. And from that, we can see that she's fairly strong-minded. The queen does not tell the king that she's not going to go and do his bidding when he's got all these people there that are in his banquet, and he's trying to show off all his wealth and possessions, of which she's a part of his possessions. That's the way it is, right or wrong. And it's wrong, but that's the way it is. He wants to impress others by displaying the wealth of his kingdom. That includes his gorgeous trophy wife wearing the royal diadem. Her position and her place in life as the queen is, you just be beautiful and impress everybody else with your beauty and your mind. Simply a possession. So, Vashti refuses. I think one of the reasons why she refuses is because the Bible's careful to tell us she also has a banquet. So you have this going on. You have the king over there with all the men having their banquet. But then you have the queen. She's with all the men's wives and all the women. And so she's representing them. You know what she's saying then? She's saying to all these women at this banquet, listen, even if it's immoral, we have to give in. That's never been a teaching in the Bible, that women have to give in to immoral acts because a husband or somebody has some control over. The fact is that Vashti didn't go because she did not want to be thought of as being simply an object to be looked at. But I do want to say something, and I think it's very careful for us to understand about the story, especially as we go through on this book of Esther. The author, amazingly, does not make any moral or ethical evaluation in this book. All right? As we read through this book of Esther, there is not any moral or ethical evaluation. The king and all his men are drunk. They've had this party for 180 days. This banquet has been going for 7 days. They're in a 7-day drunk, okay? Do you have an opinion about that? I have an opinion about that. I don't think it's a good idea. In fact, it's bad. for a king to be drunk like that. The author says nothing. Then the king says, I want Vashti to come in to show her beauty. She doesn't. No kind of moral judgment put there, either on the king's request or her refusal. Throughout this, we see constantly that there are very moral and immoral things taking place, but there's no judgment passed. And the reason I say that is this. Oftentimes, we want to make a statement with regard to virtues, the virtues of a submissive wife and a dominant husband. Well, listen, the Bible says that the husband's dominant and the wife is to be submissive. However, we also need to understand that it's within the context of a loving relationship. I want to point out again, this relationship was never mentioned as being a husband and wife relationship. It was mentioned in a political realm only of king and queen. King and queen. However, we need to note that what is happening here is not some teaching that's teaching women they need, and I read commentators who say, Vashti, she is such a great example. She's such a horrible example of a submissive wife. I have heard that preached about how she is a horrible wife because she did not submit to her husband's wishes. That is categorically not what is being taught here. All right? Not whatsoever. This episode of what's happening here with Vashti, it's actually the reason that the author is pointing it out to us is not to give us some kind of marital instructions. He's telling us because he wants us to know what's going on inside the courtroom, inside the king's court, the palace court. He wants us to know what this picture of life is like. And in this context, the rest of Esther's story resides within this context of where the king wields absolute power. You and I, we don't get this. We don't get this. We are not in any situation, if we don't want to be, where we're under somebody else's absolute authority. We always have recourse, and oftentimes, if it's illegal, we have legal recourse. And even, especially in democracies, we don't get it. But when you're in this situation where the king is the absolute authority, when he says jump, your only response is to say, how high? You don't have a choice to discuss it. You don't have anything to say about it. So we're not accustomed to that. What the author is trying to show us here is being under the control of a capricious and uncertain, unknown entity of this king. He's got this absolute power. Both Vashti and Esther are locked in this relationship. Locked in a relationship with Xerxes that is sexually and politically highly charged. Highly charged. And the thing is that we see from this, Vashti, unusual in an Oriental situation like this, unusual for a queen to say no to the king, but yet she does, it's recorded, and that decision to say no to the king had incredible influence on what happens then to seeing God's people saved. That decision, she had no idea when she made that decision what was going to happen to her. She had no idea that she could have been killed. We don't know actually what happened. The least of what would have happened to her, she would have been banned from ever seeing the king again. She would have gone to the dormitory for concubines to live there for the rest of her life, never ever coming out into public light again. May as well have been hung rather than go through that fate anyway. We also see here that this one decision that Ahasuerus makes in a drunken state, whatever led him to do this, I don't know, but in a drunken state he says, by the way, go get the queen and parade her so they can all see her beauty. That decision sets in motion, again, this whole story about how God then begins to work to bring salvation to his people. Something very unusual, highly unlikely. If we were writing the story, it would have been the last thing that we would have written there. And so in this way, because of what Vashti has done, the whole story begins to take a different direction. I got to move pretty quickly. Thirdly, there's Haman, or Haman would be the proper pronunciation. Haman is the officer of the court. Esther chapter 3, verse 1 says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him. Notice he's called Haman the Agagite. What does that mean? Back in the Old Testament, back in the older stories, there was a king Agag, who was the king of the Amalekites. The Amalekites have the distinction of being the first people in the world to attack and try to destroy God's people. God's people are moving to the promised land. And we read in there, in this moving to the promised land, they asked the Amalekites, can we just go through? We're going to go on the freeway. We won't get on the farm roads. We're going to stay right on the high road and go through here. Won't bother you at all. And they said, no. You come through here, and so they attacked the people of God. First people in the world to attack God's people, Amalekites. And they were defeated. King Agag was destroyed. No, he should have been destroyed, but he was not. And as a result, then we've always had this problem with the Amalekites. God gave Saul, the first king, he gave him the command that you're to go to battle against the Amalekites and you are to utterly wipe them off the entire face of the earth. Not any one of them. He spared the king, he spared the animals, and then he spared some of the best, and he made excuse to Samuel saying, the people did it, not me. So that was Saul's downfall, besides the fact that he did carry out God's instruction. As a result, there was this tension between the Israelites and the Amalekites, and now here we are. Here's Mordecai, who we're told, we'll see in just a bit, he's of the kin of Benjamin. He's a Benjaminite from the family of Kish. Saul's father was named Kish. And so we see a guy who comes from that, and now he's asked to bow down to an offspring or to one of the family of the Amalekites. So there's a lot of undercurrent going on here, and Haman, or Haman being this person, the Bible tells us about Haman that, we're told about Haman that his Hebrew, his name sounds very similar to the Hebrew word for wrath, which is Hama. So Haman and Hama, and it would be an apt description of his temperament and in his role in this story. So Haman is he's Agag the Agagite. Haman is the enemy of the Jews. 5 years into Esther's queenship, Haman manipulates the king to destroy this people called the Jews. The king, though extremely powerful, easily manipulated, and Haman's overweening pride is what destroys his plan. He's so prideful of himself. He's angry that Mordecai won't bow to him. He goes back to his wife and he brags about how great he is. He's been promoted to this place in the king. Esther has just invited him to a banquet with him and the king. And what irritates him is this guy Mordecai who won't bow. And he says, I'm going to kill him. So then the next day we'll see that he goes into the courtroom and the court says, the king says to him, Haman, what should be done for the man that the king loves the most, that the king wants to delight the most? And so he's thinking, of course, that it has to be him. There can't possibly be anybody else. And he gives his long list of all the things that he ever wanted to impress everybody else about how great he is. And then the king says, take Mordecai and do what you said. Crushing blow. The beginning of the end. He was so caught up with himself, so full of himself, that it caused him then to end up being Haman the loser. Caught up in the circumstances of his hatred and pride, his fall from glory was swift, deadly, total. He is the picture. Haman is a picture of how God defeats wickedness, promote his people. if you ever get a chance to read Karen Jobes, who wrote a book on Esther for the NIV, she has some very keen insight. She says this: God's absolute sovereignty is displayed magnificently in the great paradox that even Satan's wrath and retribution, working through worldly powers, is nevertheless constrained by God's eternal decrees. God works concurrently through the very forces that Satan means for evil to bring about his perfect good. For example, Satan clearly meant for evil that Jesus should be crucified, yet God brought it in the resurrection. He meant it for great glory. It was with this confidence that the early church prayed for boldness to preach the gospel while facing life-threatening opposition. It's with this same confidence Christians today can face the powers of evil arrayed against them, because we know that God is working behind every scene. Quickly, Mordecai. Mordecai is the exiled Jew. We first see him in Esther chapter 2. There was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Now, we might initially think that it was Mordecai who was carried away. That would have meant he was well over 100 years. What it's referring to is his offspring, his grandfather, Kish, a Benjaminite, was carried away from Jerusalem and carried away. Now, so Mordecai, along with his cousin Esther, they are what we would call PBCs or PBJs, Persian-born Jews, as opposed to ABCs or okay, so it's not peanut butter and jelly, it's PBJ, Persian-born Jew. They would have been second-generation Jews there, and so they would have been very accustomed to the ways of the kingdom and so forth. But Mordecai, this exiled Jew, he had a Babylonian name. It turns out that his Babylonian name is connected with Marduk, or Merodach, who is the Babylonian Assyrian god. Very common to happen. When Daniel and his cohorts were taken into Babylon, they were also given names of Babylonian gods. The purpose is this: to bring them away from their culture, to embrace them into the foreign culture, to help them to leave their old ways and to begin their new ways. I've corrected myself in doing this, because oftentimes when like for example, I'll be meeting with a Chinese person, they'll tell me their Chinese name. My immediate response is, "Do you have an English name?" And oftentimes they'll tell me, "No, they don't have an English name." And I realize that by doing that, it's impolite. It's rude to be asking the Chinese for their English name. It's like if I were to come and visit you and I would tell you my name's David Homer, they go, "Oh, fine. What's your Chinese name?" It's what it's doing then, and the purpose for doing it. This, when people were taken out of their country and placed in exile, the first thing they would do is they would give them another name, another identity, because they wanted to leave the old behind and make a distance. Hey, it's true, too, for in our own life, when we get away from this community and we get out into the world wants to put us in a different way. They want a different look. They want to have a different perspective on us, and they will not want us to keep our identity with the community of Jesus Christ and our identity as Christians. So they might want to call us anything other else than Christians. Mordecai adopts his uncle's daughter, his cousin. It's kind of odd that you would adopt your cousin, but she must have been much younger than him. It would have be the same thing for me if I was to adopt then the son or the daughter of my father's brother. Okay, that would be my uncle. So it would be my cousin. And for me to have one of my cousins as to raise them as a son or a daughter, there would have been that difference in age. So there must have been quite a span in that family there. Nonetheless, he took her on because she had no parents. She was an orphan, and however she was orphaned, we don't know. Mordecai warned her not to reveal her people. he would daily inquired of her well-being. He was very concerned, very fatherly, very watching over her. And when the time came, Mordecai then was the one who told Esther, this is the time. Either you go stand before the king or all the people are gone. He says, this is the time. You must take the stand. And then after that, Mordecai stayed in Persia, and it became his adopted home. Now, we're going to spend more time on Esther, but I just want to say very quickly, she's introduced in Esther chapter 2, verse 7. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. So we see here a young woman, very sad because of her situation, but very, very beautiful. Both parents have died. She's now being cared for by her cousin, and I don't know if she called him cousin Mordecai, but actually Mordecai treated her like a daughter. She must have looked at him as being a father. She probably was the only child, because we don't hear of any other child or any other siblings, and probably she was born, the parents died quite young, and so it was left up to Mordecai to take care of her. The author states that Esther is very beautiful. The reason that he states that is because he's setting us up for what's coming next, for her being chosen as a queen. She's the only person in the story that has two names, a Jewish and a Persian name. She's depicted then as being a young woman living in these two worlds, between these two worlds. Again, when we look at the story of how she becomes queen of mighty Persia, it's an unbelievable story, an unbelievable story. For example, kings rarely choose their queen by having a random beauty contest. Even Solomon, when Solomon was choosing a queen, he goes and marries the daughter from the king in Egypt. Why? Because he wants to make that alliance there. It's often for political reasons. It's often for reasons of wealth, reasons of influence, but almost never, I don't want to say never because I don't know of any other thing, but it's highly unusual that a king is going to choose a queen by having a beauty contest. There's nothing to be gained. However, him being Ahasuerus and owning everything, the largest empire in the world, taking 180 days to display his wealth, maybe he's thinking, hey, I don't care what influence she has, I just want her to be good looking. Obviously, that's something that was very important to him at that time. So, what we see in this, though, is that the work of God is unmistakable. Think about it. A little orphaned Jewish girl who probably never in her wildest dreams thought about becoming a queen, much less would a Jewish girl dream about being the queen of Persia, and now she finds herself on this world stage. Most of us like to think that through thoughtful planning and wise living, we can successfully direct the course of our life. We like to think that we can, but through planning and through proper living, making wise decisions, we can plan the course of our life. We cannot. When I was 10 years old, my dad was killed in a car accident. Nobody planned that. Least of all me. Certainly not my mother. I mean, one day I went to bed just like any normal 10-year-old kid would be, and my mom stayed up waiting for Dad to come home. He didn't. Knock on the door, police show up and say, hey, your husband's in a car accident. Next morning I wake up, there's people all around our house. Mom has to explain, Dad was killed in a car accident. Life-changing? Yeah, life-changing. Expected? Planned for? Not at all. Not at all. And we all know there's always these kinds of things. You know, something that strikes me is how tenuous and how fragile all of life is. We never know when some tragedy will happen. Why? How many times have you heard the story about somebody who was walking across the street and a driver driving too fast hits them and kills them. We hear these stories. How about going to a Christian university in Seattle, Washington, and a gunman shows up with rifles and rounds, and he begins firing and kills 3 people? I mean, how random is that? He has nothing at all. He's not a student there, and life, I don't know if he shoots 3 people. But you know how fragile life is? It can change in a moment. But we always need to remember, there's never a surprise with God. This past week, I got a letter from Chad Freeman, who is suffering from immense pain. It's been over a year now. He still suffers from incredible pain. It's getting much worse. I don't know if the pain is getting worse or if the medicine is no longer effective. It's highly addictive medicine. So not only is he an addict, a drug addict, he still has this immense pain. He has these waves and waves of depression and darkness where all he wants to do is just commit suicide. And he told me, he says, I had these constant thoughts of suicide. And yet he says, I try my best to hold on to some hope that God's going to do something. He has been to doctor after doctor after doctor after doctor in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, on the east coast of America, the west coast of America, and every single doctor has said exactly the same thing. We find nothing wrong. It's like time and again hitting up against a brick wall. What do you do? What do you do? And I told him, I said, my only hope that I can give to you is that you have to understand God is not surprised. And God will not put you through anything that you cannot, that it's too much for you to bear. I don't know what else to say to him. I certainly don't understand. I certainly can't empathize. And yet we have to understand that whatever God is doing, God is working in all these circumstances of our life. Our sense of ultimately being in control is actually an illusion. It's an illusion. That's why I say to you this. If there's anything that we can learn from this story, it's we need to admit there's someone bigger than I am. There's someone greater than I. I just cannot myself live without that understanding. I mean, I was driving down the road the other day, minding my own business. And here comes a motorcycle driver who's driving too fast, and he's driving on the wrong side of my car. So I begin to shift lanes. I have my blinker on, but he doesn't pay any attention. And as he's trying to get in, he clips my front end. And he goes sprawling on the ground. He got messed up, broken shoulder, all messed up. I have to pay the bill because I have the insurance. You know, it ticked me off. It really ticked me off. But then I began to think about it. God wasn't surprised. God saw that thing coming the whole time. What can I learn from it that God is trying to teach me? What's going on? And the only way that we can deal with all the uncertainties of life is just to look up to heaven and say, you know what, God, I don't have control of this life. And no matter what happens, I just have to realize there's someone bigger than me who knows the ins, the outs, the ups, the downs. He knows the crashes. He knows the one. No surprises for God. So we need to be careful lest we have this false sense of security and control. Esther is taken into the king's court because her beauty is attractive to the king. You know what? Listen, careful. Basically, it was a sexual decision. That's just the horrible truth of it all. This Jewish girl, an orphan, was chosen because she was beautiful. And she pleased the king more than any other one, and she became the queen. It was not a political move. It was a move for a king who wanted a trophy wife. Did she have any control over it? None so ever. Did God use it for glory? God absolutely. God has promised that when our lives are in His hands, He will work good things. Look at this verse. This verse actually goes before the verses I read earlier. I read these verses about His foreknowledge, and here's what he says in verse 28. This is Paul speaking. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to His purpose. For those whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, in order that He might be the firstborn among many brethren. And those whom He predestined, He also called. Those whom He called, He also justified. And those whom He justified, He also glorified. You see, I've said that verse time and time again. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to His purpose. God already sees it. It's part of His foreknowledge. It's part of His providence. So the question is this. The question is, that's not a question. Here's the option. The option is this. God, I need someone bigger than me. And I turn my face to You, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I turn to You and say, God, I trust You. I'm going to depend on You. Or the option is to say, no, God, I think I'm in control of my own life. I think I can make the right decisions. It's living a life of illusion, because no one has control over their life. I gladly say, God, You have control. I can trust You. That's what. And it's just that simple. And if Esther teaches us anything, it's that God's hand is in control here in all these things because He's greater. Did you see His name anywhere mentioned? No. He's still in control. So many people say, well, I've never seen God. Open up your good eyes. Let's pray. Father, I thank You again for the story of Esther. Thank You for all the intrigue that goes on. And Lord, even just the hard, cold facts of life. I mean, here's a girl who, for all we know, wanted to grow up, marry a Jewish man, have a good Jewish family, and suddenly is taken out of that world, and her life has changed completely. Yet, You used her in glory and honor to Your name in saving the people of Israel, saving the people of God. I pray, Lord, that in our life we'll be careful to just give our life in humble submission to the Most High God. Realize that You then are best able to control all the things of our life and to let You, Lord, lead in the direction that You say is best for us. Remember that all things work together for good. Those who love God and called according to Your purpose, and it's by Your foreknowledge that You have predestined us, justified. Thank You now, Heavenly Father, that You've given us this story. Give us a new light and new insight into life. If we're here today and we have not yet recognized the Most High God and the fact that You sent Your Son Jesus to die for us, to open up our way into Your holiness, Lord, that today would be the day we would submit ourselves to You and come to Jesus Christ. I pray these things in Jesus' name.